Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General, and this is my second video of today, the first being my full battle gameplay of the Battle of the Fallen Gates, which was the Total War Warhammer 2 demo we got to play when I went to visit Creative Assembly Studios. But in this video, we are going to look at some of the stats of the units we saw in that video to have a look at how they compare against each other and how they compare to some of the armies we saw in the first game. And although they might not be directly comparable at this stage, having looked at them, I think it's fair to say that they'll be within that region and we can get an idea of what Creative Assembly are thinking in terms of how they see the units playing, how they might compare against each other. So let's kick things off, shall we? We will start with the general in the Battle of the Fallen Gates, which was Cleric Gar. Now, Cleric Gar had a couple of abilities. As you see, he has a huge amount of health, strong armor, strong leadership, good melee attack, good melee defense. Now, Cleric Gar is going to be one of the top melee lords, particularly when he's on top of Grimlock, his mount, which these stats count as. Now, he has a couple of things: armored, armor piercing, causes terror. He also has siege breaker and some missile resistance, we can see from the bottom, as well as frenzy. Now, in the battle, he had a couple of extra feats as well, which was he had the Rod of Storms and the ability Cold-Blooded. Now, a lot of the generals are going to have this Cold-Blooded ability. As you can see in the top right, it's a regen that slows you down and makes you worse at attacking. So be careful when you use it. Don't use it if you're trying to catch up to a unit or in the middle of a fight, really. You want to use it when you're kind of broken out of combat and you're free and kind of stroming around. And his other ability was the Rod of Storms. Now, I'm not sure if this is an upgrade he had or just something he got given, or it's tied to one of his items. I don't think it would be tied to either of his magic items here, but that's the Rod of Storm ability we saw in the battle. Now, his magical items should give him some other abilities, but I'm assuming he maybe didn't have them in this demo. So maybe some more to even come from Cleric Gar. Now, in terms of comparing Cleric Gar to other characters, other legendary lords, I think there's only one we can really compare him to fairly, and that is Cleric Sun-Eater, the Big Daddy himself. So, as we see, better armor than Cleric, better leadership than Cleric, a little bit slower than him. Comparable melee attack, although Cleric does take it on that one, and he has a better melee defense for Cleric. Weapon strength goes to Cleric Gar, and charge bonus goes to Cleric Gar. Now, he has a little bit more health, minusculely more, but it would be a fairly romping fight. Whether that armor will make up for the difference in melee defense and melee attack, hard to say. And a lot of the stats we're going to be looking at today, there are hidden stats for these units, such as the speed of their attacks, how often they attack, how frequently they attack. So I think it would be an interesting show-up. I think, like, gut feeling, maybe looking at this, I think Cleric might take it, depending on who got the better charge off, I suppose. It would be interesting. It would be an interesting matchup to see. That weapon strength higher level is very interesting as well. But, you know, I think a fair comparison. They're pretty close. And I think they could go toe-to-toe, just depending on how the rest of a certain battle went, on who comes out on top in terms of these two monstrous legendary lords. So that's Cleric Gar. Now let's throw in a character who wasn't seen in that battle, just for fun and just because we have their stats, and that is Mundi, the other Lizardmen legendary lord. We can see here his stats on the left. He has a huge amount of health for a wizard, I suppose. There's 6,406. But this is a level 30 on the campaign. Now, bear in mind, I think Cleric Gar is the kind of stats we'll see him as having in a custom battle, rather than necessarily in the campaign. So, here we are, and this is a bit of a harder one to read. Now, he's obviously much more of a force to be reckoned with once he's got his mount Slack, I think it is. And he also gets a ranged attack. Now, the ranged attacks will probably be coming from the skinks, throwing javelins, poison javelins out. So that's where that comes from. Now, the fact that the ammunition's at 0, I'm not sure if that means that they won't fire, or maybe it's just a glitch in this early version of the game. But that is Mundi there. Looks quite a significant deal when he has his mount. Without the mount, he'll still be a very powerful magic user, but with the mount, he looks like he could pack quite a punch as well. So there's Mazda Mundi stats for you. Hard to compare him to anybody really, so I didn't really draw up a comparison on this one, but just to let you know Mazda Mundi's stats, he has that. I've made a video about Mazda Mundi's upgrade tree where I mention magic options maybe a little bit limited. There's not as much maybe player customization as one would want in terms of his magic choices, but that's a different video for a different day. So moving on from Mazda Mundi, let's go back to the general of the Elves in this battle, who was Amendil, apparently. Now, Amendil, sort of fairly standard. I think he probably has the same stats as a generic general for the High Elves. Now, let's compare that to generic generals for some other armies. Let's look at a general of the Empire and a Chaos Lord. Now, he had better missile resistance than the Empire general, but less armor overall. Slightly better leadership, comparable speed, comparable melee attack, significantly higher melee defense, and less strong weapon strength. So it looks like they'll outlast a general of the Empire, but not do as much damage as a general of the Empire, which is an interesting comparison for the two of them there. And I think they'll probably be on similar health. If you can see, Amendil's injured in the screen grab I managed to get of his statistics. But that's him. Now, in terms of the Chaos Lord has the same missile resistance, much better armor, about comparable leadership, comparable speed, better melee attack. Again, worst melee defense. That melee defense is really quite a high value. Now, whether that's coming from some kind of boost, the extra additional melee defense there, that might be completely probable. In terms of the boost that the Elves get, which I think is martial prowess, which is when they're fresh and not that injured, they actually fight better. So I think he might be benefiting from that on this screen, but still fairly high there. And again, weapon strength higher for the Chaos Lord. So interesting. Maybe just he'll last a bit longer, maybe not as strong as the other generals, at least as they compare at the moment in the first game compared to this one. So there's the Elven general for you. Now let's look at some of the mages. Now the mages were in chariots. These were the two mages, Phalos Amendir and Valin Derelak. And they have, I think, yeah, exactly the same stats. Charge bonus is pretty high because they are on chariots at the moment and their speed is 76. Now, the only magicians on chariots I could think of to compare it to was maybe the Bray Shamans. Now, as you can see, compared to the Bray Shamans, they are quicker. Their armor's lower, however, and their weapon strength is lower. But you're not really looking to charge your wizards into battle too often. So there we go. And they didn't have a full retinue of spells, these wizards, in this demo either. We've seen a couple. We saw the Flame Vortex. They have Shem's Burning Gaze. The Valin does, at least apparently. And Phalos has the one where the Phoenix is summoned and a flame stream goes out from underneath the Phoenix. Now, it's not Phoenix as in the models of the Phoenix units that will play in the High Elf army. It's just a magical Phoenix that appears and goes over the battlefield. But, yeah, you know, comparable. Fair enough that they're maybe not as hardy as the Bray Shamans with their chariots. But, you know, there we go. The High Elves wizards on chariots. Although I will say that in the army list they revealed, they said wizards don't have mounts. So whether these chariot-mounted wizards are just special for this battle, or wizards will have mounts, is a little bit up in the air. Moving on from the wizards, let's look at the spearmen from both armies. So we have the High Elf spears, and we have the Souris with spears. Now, comparably, Souris higher armor, less missile defense, better leadership for the Souris, comparable speed, one difference, and the High Elves are a little bit quicker. Melee attack, better for the Souris. Melee defense, better for the High Elves, but again, that might be boosted by martial prowess. And weapon strength, better, of course, for the Souris. Also, less Souris in a unit. 120 is Spearman unit, and 100 Souris. Now, these are directly comparable to, I think it's unit size large for other armies as well. Now, if we chuck in a couple more spear units to compare it to, let's throw in the Empire Shielded Spearmen and the Eternal Guard for the Wood Elves. Again, more hit points and more units for the High Elves, almost as high as the Empire Spearman unit. And all in all, compared to, I think the fairest comparison for the High Elves is probably going to be the Wood Elves. So let's have a look at that. Same armor, Slightly better leadership for the Wood Elves. Speed, slightly quicker for the Wood Elves. Melee attack, slightly better for the Wood Elves. Melee defense, again, perhaps artificially boosted there, but better for the High Elves. Because they'll always have that martial prowess thing going anyway, so at least at the beginning it'll be better for the High Elves. And weapon strength, slightly higher for the High Elves. Interesting. Charge bonus, almost nothing, but better for the Wood Elves. Now, the Empire, compared to something like the Souris, would just get, it looks like, destroyed. Way better armor for the Souris, and even, I mean, compared to the High Elves as well, the Empire Spearmen are a bit left in the dust. And I think any of these other Spearmen unit going against them would take them to task, particularly with 120 in the High Elf army. So one would have to assume the High Elf Spearmen can take the Eternal Guard. Simply, although the Eternal Guard are better, there's just a lot more health and hit points in the High Elf Spearmen unit, and they're not that bad compared to the Eternal Guard, and I think the extra hit points will probably make the difference there. Alright guys, let's move on from the Spears, all of course with anti-large, charge defense against large, and they're all the shielded variants of Spearmen there. Now, Souris Warriors, just the normal Souris Warriors, sorry, got a bit of ahead of ourselves there. Fairly strong unit, again, quite high melee attack and melee defense. Now let's compare them to some high-end, well, medium tier, sort of better off armies with better infantry. So Chaos, less armor, less armor than the Chaos units. They have better leadership than the Chaos units. They're, of course, quicker than Chaos. And Chaos kind of beat them in melee attack and melee defense as well. So it looks like Chaos Warriors would be able to take Souris Warriors with shields. However, the weapon strength is significantly better for the Souris Warriors. Once they hit, they can do a lot of more damage than the Chaos Warriors, which is interesting. This would actually be a hard one to compare because they have the same amount of units, but look at how much more health the Souris Warriors have. So I think the Souris Warriors, I can't wait to do some testing on this, but it looks very interesting in terms of a matchup because the Chaos Warriors are better, but they have less hit points. And so whether the high weapon strength will make up for that for the Souris Warriors will be interesting to see. And even compared to the Grave Guard here, we've got the 90 armor, better missile defense as well, leadership better for the Souris, speed better for Souris. And the Souris do have them beat, however, on melee attack, and the Grave Guard are taking it on melee defense just by 2 points, and they're thrashing them on weapon strength, the Souris are, over the Grave Guard. And the Grave Guard have that higher level of life as well, and they have more units, so that also would be an interesting one, and whether fear gets to the Souris Warriors as well, whether their morale can hold out, but they do have that very high leadership value. So very interesting matchups there, just seeing them sort of a head-to-head comparison of these units. So Souris Warriors, I think, could probably hold its own against both of these units, if I'm honest. I'm not sure which one would be most likely to win out of them. They each bring something a little bit different to the table. But can't wait to do some testing on it, just to give you guys an idea. This is kind of where I see them fitting in, kind of around the Chaos Warrior Grave Guard level of the Souris Warriors with shields. And now let's move on to the White Lions, a High Elf unit, an elite fighting infantry bodyguard for the High Elves. And they have a couple of things. They're not, perhaps, I think, essentially, it sounded like in previous descriptions of the High Elf roster as though the White Lions have maybe been slightly nerfed compared to their characters on the tabletop, because they're considered very high tier, whereas I think Creative Assembly are trying to pitch them as kind of a mid-tier infantry unit. Now, they do have missile resistance from their Lion Cloaks. They do have Forest Rider, because traditionally, this is a bit of a stretch lore-wise, but I'm willing to let it go. Traditionally, the first formation of the White Lions was formed out of woodmen, and that's why they tend to use axes as well. But since then, they've actually just been made out of war veterans and soldiers who are recruited into the ranks of the White Lions. So that doesn't really hold anymore, but, you know, it's a nice little quirk going back to their origins of Forest Strider. Armored, armor piercing as well, which can be hugely important. Now, let's compare them to some other Great Axe infantry, shall we? So we've got the Chaos Warriors with great weapons and the Black Orcs. So lower armor, higher leadership, much quicker. These guys are actually fairly rapid at 36 speed. Melee attack, same as the Chaos Warriors with great weapons, and same as the Black Orcs. Melee defense, higher than both the Black Orcs and the Chaos Warriors with great weapons. And weapon strength is lower than the others, at 33 compared to the Chaos Warriors 38 and the Black Orcs 42. So that might be the crucial differentiator there. And they also have less health, if you look at it. So I think it'd be an interesting fight with the Chaos Warriors with great weapons. They'd probably hold their own there, but they might struggle against the Black Orcs themselves, which I suppose is fair enough, as the Black Orcs are probably the most elite infantry for the Greenskins. But that's how the White Lions of Crace stack up against their other great axe infantry in the game, and sort of where they fit in tier-wise. So let's move on to the Swordmasters now. So with the Swordmasters, we have the Great Swords, and we have the Grave Guard with Great Weapon. These guys are all Great Sword infantry. Now, we've been told just straight up that the Swordmasters can take out a regiment of Great Swords. Now let's have a look at how they do that stat-wise. So armor, slightly lower for the Swordmasters. Speed, they're a lot quicker. Same charge bonus. Higher weapon strength. Way higher melee defense. And higher melee attack. So that kind of makes sense, even though the Great Swords have more people, have another 20 soldiers in the army there. But they have slightly higher HP, but not maybe enough to make up the difference in that weapon strength and melee attack skill and melee defense skill. So I can see the Swordmasters taking the Great Swords. Now, comparing them to the Grave Guard with great weapons, they're probably easily taking that as well, with their 36 melee attack compared to the 22, and with the 42 melee defense compared to the 25, and they have the same weapon strength. So even though they lose it in the hit points and the number of soldiers in the unit, they could probably quite easily take the Grave Guard. Now, chosen with great weapons, I don't think they are maybe able to take. You're looking at melee defense 42 versus 44, 46 melee attack versus 36, and the hit points there quite high. Sorry that the units have been cut off there from the end. I must have misjudged the size of this frame. But that is where we have the chosen with great weapons. I think with the extra HP as well, I think chosen with great weapons beat the Swordmasters. But everything else, of the great sword infantry, Swordmasters are probably the best. Now for some archer time, some missile fire. Let's have a look. Best comparison probably Glade Guard and Peasant Bowmen from Bretonnia. Range, same as the Glade Guard, same as the Wood Elves. Missile damage, slightly less. Ammunition, slightly more. So they can fire for longer, but they do a little bit less damage. So that's interesting. Again, most of the stats are comparable. Slightly higher leadership, slightly quicker, worse melee attack, better melee defense, and slightly worse weapon strength. But there we go. And for the Peasant Bowmen, we're looking at they have less range than the Elves do, and their missile damage is the same as the Elven Archers, and they have slightly less ammunition but more than the Wood Elves. So that's interesting. Again, probably, as they have been described, probably the best regimented archer unit in the game. So looking forward to seeing them there. All right, guys, let's move on to the Skink Skirmishers. And we have the Skink Skirmishers here, looking good. Missile damage, 23. Now, comparing it to like the ranges of the Dwarves, because we're looking at kind of short range stuff here I was trying to compare it to, and then just some Ungol Raiders. It's not the easiest comparison to make, but they do more damage than the Ungol Raiders do. They have, of course, less range. They have slightly more range than the Dwarven Rangers, a lot more ammunition than the Dwarven Rangers, but can't nearly stack up to them in a melee fight with their 16 and 18, which is lower than the Ungol Raiders and the Dwarven Rangers as well. So they can lay down some damage. We saw that in the video there. They managed to do some good damage to that Sun Dragon in fairly rapid succession. But unfortunately, it looks like if you actually nail them down, because they are rapid, look at that speed, 46. They will run away. They'll manage to run away from most things, but you can pin them down with missile fire from other armies as well, or just a cavalry unit after them will put a swift end to them as well. Okay, so moving on to the Temple Guard. The elite infantry of the Lizardmen army, armored and shielded, armor piercing, charge defense against large foes, and, oh, I'm actually surprised that they don't seem to have anti-large, which is interesting. But they might do, I'm not 100% sure on that. But it's just not listed here. But comparing it to some other halberd units, I'm sure they must have anti-large, I just don't think they've listed it. Comparing them to some other halberdier units, they have lower armor than anything except the Empire halberdiers on the far left end there. But they do have the shields, which allows them that extra missile resistance. Leadership is huge, 90, speed 32, quickest of them all, melee attack 32, better than the Warriors of Chaos, not as good as the Chosen with halberds, and yeah, again, better than the Empire by far. And melee defense 36, same as the Chaos Warriors with halberds, worse than the Chosen with halberds, and of course, actually, oh, yeah, indeed, worse than the Empire with halberds as well, in terms of melee defense. Weapon strength is the same as the Chosen, so that's interesting. They look like they could take most of, well, I suppose you'd rarely put halberd against halberd. You'd be looking at getting the halberds in against larger units. But yeah, fairly strong, huge amounts of health topping this chart by far, 9,600 health for the Temple Guard there, which is huge. Unit size, you know, matching the Warriors, more than the Chosen, and less than the Empire Halberdiers. So Temple Guard looks like they can cause a lot of damage, were hugely effective in the battle I got to play with them, so looking forward to getting the Temple Guard out on the battlefield. Now the Illyrian Reavers, the light cavalry of the Empire, of the High Elves. Now, comparing them to the Mounted Yeomen and the Wild Riders, I think was probably the fairest comparison. Speed quicker than the Mounted Yeomen, oh no, speed slower than the Mounted Yeomen, about the same speed as Wild Riders. They do have a higher melee attack than the Yeomen, and they do have a better melee defense than the Yeomen, and a higher weapon strength, and a better charge bonus. So better than the Yeomen, not quite as good as the Wild Riders, which is to be expected, really. But they are fairly solid, quite a good, handy, light cav, one has to imagine. And they will, in the final version of the game, have a bow variant as well. So you'll get a missile cav with the High Elves as well, who are Illyrian Reavers. This was the speared variant here. Okay, guys, let's move on to some more cav, the Cold Ones and the Silver Helms. We have them compared to Black Knights and Empire Knights. Now, the Cold One Riders, fairly high armor, higher than the Black Knights, lower than the Empire. But let's go to some of the more important stats. The melee attack, lower than Black Knights, lower than Empire Knights, and lower than the Silver Helms as well, in terms of the Cold One Spear Riders. Now, bear in mind, this isn't the most elite form of cavalry that the Lizardmen have, or the High Elves for that matter, in terms of the Silver Helms. But weapon strength 40, that beats everything else out of the park. And melee defense, again, lowest of the three here, in terms of the melee attack and melee defense, which is interesting in terms of the Cold One Spear Riders. Fairly high charge though, 42, beats out the Black Knights, not quite as good as Empire Knights or the Silver Helms. Now the Silver Helms in comparison, 26 melee attack, 32 melee defense. That is the same melee attack as Empire Knights and slightly better melee defense, and better melee attack and melee defense than the Black Knights. So it could probably take Black Knights. This is an unshielded variant of the Silver Helms, however. They do have a shield variant in the final army of the High Elves to deal with. So fair enough comparison there. They're doing okay against each other. Yeah, so that's about it. That's how they all stack up. Health-wise, again, interestingly, the Lizardmen not smashing the health as they have done in previous unit comparisons. You know, fairly middling. Better than the Empire and the Silver Helms, not quite as good as the Black Knights, and there are less of them than any of these other units as well. Only 48 in the Cold One Riders unit. But they do have armor piercing and anti-large, which is a good little combo to have. So moving on to the Targon Riders. We have the Hawk Riders is, I think, the fairest comparison as another kind of missile flying unit. Now, compared to them, the missile damage is much higher. The range is half of what it is for the Hawks, and the ammunition is slightly less as well. Now, this is the Fire Leech Bowler version of the Pterodons. There's also a Javelin version, which will have poison damage instead of fire damage, but speed-wise, significantly slower than the Hawk Riders. But once they get into melee as well, they have a lower melee attack than Hawk Riders, but a higher melee defense. So I think they'll probably be as effective. Their weapon strength is much higher than the Hawk Riders, however, at 65 compared to their 45. So get them in there. They'll be able to do some good work in melee against some missile units, stuff like that. They'll be able to see them off and probably scare them away because they cause fear, and they have missile resistance, and they have the bombs, which the Hawks don't either. So quite a utility player here, the Pterodon Rider. And, you know, fair enough stacking up, not quite as quick. They play how one would imagine a pterodactyl versus a giant hawk might play off against each other. But interestingly enough as well, there are a lot less of them. There's only 10 of them compared to the Hawks' 24. But fairly high health for only having the 10 of them at 3,300. And the 24 Hawks at only 4,080. So fair enough there on the Pterodons and the Hawk Riders. Now the Feral Staggered On. Now you have to just compare this guy to a couple of monsters. So we've got the Varghulf, the Giant, and the Arachnarok Spider. Now way higher armor than the Varghulf, way higher leadership, not quite as fast. Varghulf is fairly rapid at 80, but also lower melee attack and lower melee defense, but also a lot more health than the Varghulf, and a huge amount more weapon strength, and a much higher charge bonus. Both of them cause terror. So that's the two of them compared. It would be an interesting matchup to have those two go head to head. And looking across, comparing it to the Arachnarok, higher armor for the Arachnarok, lower leadership, about the same speed as an Arachnarok, really. And but the Arachnarok wins in melee attack and melee defense as well, but not quite as high weapon strength as the Staggered On, and nowhere near the charge of the Staggered On either. Now, the Giants are just a monster to throw in there, and the Giant's the only thing that actually beats the Staggered On in terms of weapon strength. And, you know, higher leadership than the Staggered On, lower armor, but way higher melee attack, and higher melee defense as well. So, Giant will probably take a Feral Staggered On, but there are upgraded versions of Staggered Ons as well, bear in mind. This is the lowest tier of Staggered On, and I can't wait till we can see what those upgraded versions of the Staggered On look like. So next up we have the Feral Bastiladon, and he is compared against, again, the same units, because they're both kind of feral large monsters. Now this guy, again, huge amounts of armor, 140, not quite as high as the Arachnarok, but he does have fairly low, compared to the rest of these monsters, melee attack and melee defense. Quite high health, higher than the Varghulf, and a punchy attack as well at 250, which beats out the Varghulf, but nothing compared to the Arachnarok or the Giant. So less hard hitting, but he does have the fairly high armor, can take a lot of punishment. And he kind of plods along. Look at the speed, 40 compared to 80, compared to 57, compared to 38. So slightly quicker than a Giant for the Bastiladon. Now the Sun Dragon. Only real monster to compare it to without a rider, I figured, was the Terrorgeist. Now, the Sun Dragon is the worst of the dragons in the High Elf army, bear in mind. I don't mean worst, but, you know, the youngest. He won't be the strongest of them. 400 weapon strength compared to the Terrorgeist 315. The Terrorgeist does do anti-large, however, and they will, and that's maybe a differentiator there. But melee attack, much higher for the dragon. Melee defense, much higher, or actually the same for the Terrorgeist and the dragon. And charge bonus, the dragon takes that as well. And health-wise, the Terrorgeist has the advantage there. So it'd be an interesting fight. I think maybe the dragon could take the Terrorgeist. There is that armor value difference and the much higher health. But it's harder punching. It'll hit more regularly, a lot more regularly than the Terrorgeist will. And is quicker as well. And has a bigger charge. So there we go. That is the Sun Dragon compared to the Terrorgeist here. Can't wait to get my hands on one of those dragons. And Bastiladon with Solar Engine. Let's compare it to some other single unit artillery pieces, shall we? With the Luminarch and the Hell Cannon and the Cygor. So let's look at some of the important stuff. 403 damage compared to the Luminarch, which does a huge amount. The Hell Cannon, 415. So, you know, not dissimilar to the Hell Cannon's level of damage. And it does more missile damage than the Cygor. Ammunition, only 240. So that's actually the lowest of all of these single units. And ammunition does magical damage and fire damage, much like the Luminarch itself. So that's a bonus as well. Now, where this guy actually takes it is in melee as well, with the 250 weapon strength and the 22 melee attack and melee defense. You can send him in. The Basildon will get some work done. Not as high in melee attack as the Cygor, but higher melee defense than the Cygor. And in terms of health, pretty high as well. Not as high as the Cygor again, but you know, it's doing okay at 7,032. So pretty good unit. Causes terror, which only the Cygor does as well, actually. So there we go, getting some work done, handy little unit. The thing that I think will hamper it is the range. The range is a problem at 240 compared to the 300 of the Luminarch, 420 of the Hell Cannon, and 400 of the Cygor. So yeah, a bit hampered range-wise, but he doesn't mind getting in close. He can do some damage with that 250 weapon strength. Now, the Elven Artillery now, we know it has two firing modes, the 1-shot and the 13-shot mode for if you're going against a unit or a single target. 137 missile damage, range 360. Now let's compare it to the Dwarven Bolt Thrower, better range than the Dwarven one, about the same missile damage, honestly, with armor piercing. It looks like it has anti-large as well, the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower, which the Dwarven one did as well. And comparing it just to a cannon, just to give you an idea of stuff. So the cannon, much higher range. Now the ammunition between these two bolt throws, the dwarves have more ammo. This has less ammo. And yeah, we can compare the melee stuff, but for these units, it's not that important. You're really looking at the range and the missile damage. Of course, we don't have accuracy figures on this at all, but there we go. Not bad unit, handy. It's not going to be the best artillery piece in the game, but if you need one, you want it to bring down a large animal, a large monster or something, it can really help out. And it can probably lay down a good amount of damage with those 13-shot mode as well. And that about really sums it up, guys. We've gone through all the units. Sorry for the little black screen there. I wasn't sure we'd finished the presentation or not. But we've gone through all the units in that battle. Very interesting. So the theme seems to be mainly for the Lizardmen. Huge amounts of health, huge amounts of weapon strength as well. They are comparable to other units when it comes to... They're not necessarily the best at melee attack and melee defense, but that weapon strength advantage they tend to take into it. Elves, they're quick. They can do some... They have some good melee attack and melee defense values. A little bit, well, definitely squidgier than the Lizardmen, but they can do some damage as well. So that's how all the units in the battle compared. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Do feel free to draw your own conclusions. Let me know what you think of the stats in comparison to some of the other units we've seen down in the comments below. Otherwise, guys, do check out the battle video if you haven't already, popping up in the right-hand corner now or in the description below. And do drop a like if you enjoyed the video, and do subscribe for more Total War Warhammer content. As always, guys, a special thank you to my patrons, John, Reese, Colin, Mateus, Samuel, Matthews, Daniel, and Peter. And a special thanks to all of you for watching, and I hope to catch you on the next one.